Hi, this is Parth Chanda. I'm founder and CEO of LexTegrity, and I have the privilege and honor today to have with me Hui Chen, the former DOJ compliance expert. Welcome, Hui.
Thank you, Parth. Great to be here.
Thanks. So this is part two of our three-part fireside chat series with you on how digital transformation can drive compliance program effectiveness. We're going to be focusing today on digital transformation and third-party risk management, obviously an area every compliance organization is focused on. In part one, we did a deep dive into monitoring and auditing of spend data. And in part three, we'll discuss digital transformation and enabling better business ethical decision making. So definitely check out those sessions as well. So for those of our listeners out there who don't know your background, again, you started your career as an AUSA and a trial attorney at the DOJ, and then went on to many years as a compliance professional in-house at prominent companies, including Microsoft, Pfizer, and Standard Chartered before you became the DOJ's compliance expert. So you have a tremendous background from a variety of perspectives. And so we're really excited you're here again today. Thanks.
Thank you for having me again.
So digital transformation, is often confused as simply making digital and web-based something that's being done offline or in paper. So digital transformation, as you well know, is about much more than that. It means allowing people to be able to do something entirely different because it's digital. And third-party risk management, to me, is really ripe for this kind of digital disruption. You've been very vocal about the limitations of companies' current approaches to third-party risk management. So I think that might be a good place to start. So can you elaborate on some of your thoughts and your observations on how companies manage their third-party risk today?
Sure. There's I would say at least three ways that I think companies are currently or many companies are limited in the way they approach third-party risks. So the first is the emphasis on due diligence. So if you look at the DOJ now guidance that I drafted, well, the predecessor of which I drafted, and all the prior document is fully incorporated into the current guidance. It talks about third-party management, not third-party due diligence. And the reason is precisely that we don't believe that it's about just due diligence and not monitoring. So I often give this analogy that it's, if you just do due diligence and then you don't do anything afterwards, it's like when you apply for credit card, they check your credit score and never monitor the way you use the credit card. So they let you go, over your limit. They let you don't pay. None of that they know because they don't monitor you after due diligence. Do you know any credit card company that does that? So that's so that's the first. I think that's the first category of sort of limitations. Two is something I'm also very passionate about, which is the risk silos or multiple subject matter areas. Sort of, I almost describe it as attacking the employees. So you have employees who want to onboard the third party. So you have, anti-bribery and corruption due diligence. You have financial due diligence. You have trade sanctions due diligence. You have sustainability due diligence. You have and competition law related due diligence. You have intellectual property protection related due diligence. The employees basically have to do it that many times. I don't know. I just named half a dozen risk areas. They are all being driven by different risk experts in those areas, and they each come to the employees who want to onboard third parties and demand the same thing. It's like going to the DMV, that you have to go and produce the same documents over and over and over again because these subject areas experts don't talk to each other. They not only it's burdensome on the employee, it produces a very inefficient system where you can't look at the risks in a holistic way. So I worked with a client, for example, where when I was looking at their third party, they told me that something like 80% of their third parties are designated as high risk. Now, what is the meaning of that? Like, what it loses any significance. So I said, how did you get there? Well, it's exactly how I described it. So the intellectual property people would designate certain types of vendor or third parties as having high intellectual property infringement risks. The anti-bribery corruption would designate certain ones. The sustainability sort of human trafficking people would designate yet some others. So everybody runs their own designation, and the next thing you know, like everybody's high risk, which loses all meaning. So that's sort of the second area of limitation. And I think the third one is consistent with the data theme that we've been talking about, and what we spoke about in the last chat we had, which is using the reliance on subjective determinations of what is high risk or not. It's not based on looking at anything. It's our thinking. We think, well, for this type of risk, marketing vendors must be high risk. So boom, marketing vendors are now all categorized as high risk for this particular type of risk. It's not based on anything other than, again, people's gut feelings. And that really is not a responsible way of doing something. So those are certainly the top three limitations there. I probably could go on, but probably get to stop at the three.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's probably the most succinct and powerful diagnosis of the current limitations of third-party risk management that I've ever heard. But I think it'd be great to unpack each part in maybe a little more detail, maybe starting with that first point of that overemphasis on due diligence, vis-a-vis the monitoring that happens after the diligence is done. So, that I'm completely in agreement on that. I think companies are spending way too much time and resources on front end diligence compared to monitoring. If you look at the balance of efforts, you have all sorts of enforcement actions over the years involving completely legitimate third parties, whether they're customs brokers or distributors, who would have passed due diligence with no problem, with flying colors. And the due diligence wouldn't have stopped the improper payments after, but the analytics and the monitoring of the spend might have. So really determining third-party risk, only on the basis of that due diligence, and based on due diligence is often very manual and very highly subjective on, business users who aren't fully trained on what the third party is doing. One common question, I'm sure you've seen is sort of, is this third party acting on behalf of the company? What does that mean to a layperson on behalf of, trying to explain the agency principle to an employee? So, relying so heavily on that without then actively monitoring the spend data really, to me, just creates a false sense of security around your third party risks. But then ultimately when companies think about ongoing monitoring of third parties today, what I often hear is, are you going to continue to check sanctions lists? That's part of it. That's part of the equation for sure, but it's obviously way more than that. And then it's, we've got internal audit checking on these third parties every 2 years or 3 years when they go to a market. Obviously, that's also inadequate. So yeah, I guess what ultimately is your take? I'd be curious on the internal audit piece in particular. Sort of what's your take on that? Is it enough to just rely on internal audit once the diligence is done? Or does the monitoring have to be, from your perspective, or should it be sort of more frequent than that?
Well, I think internal audit. So certainly, again, when I was at the fraud section at DOJ, we spoke of monitoring and audit as two separate things. So if we ask you what is your monitoring practice, and you tell us internal audit does it, that we interpret that answer to be you don't have a monitoring practice. So relying on internal audit, to me, is certainly it's not a non-answer. It's basically saying we don't do monitoring. So monitoring. Think about, again, back to that credit card example. Does the credit card, my credit card companies, right? So I could be traveling somewhere, and I call, I don't know, gas up my rental car in Iceland, and ping my phone, my phone sort of pings me about you have a whatever, you have this transaction at this location. Is it you? Right? That's monitoring. That they're curious now. Something in the system triggered them to ask. We're not expecting this person to be at a gas station in Iceland right now. So we might want to check if this is the person. So I can choose yes or no, and once I choose it, I can proceed with the transaction. That's how credit card company does monitoring. I would like to know, though, whether credit card companies do that with their compliance department. So we're back to
Yeah.
that point about you're perfectly capable of doing this. I mean, think about a company like Uber. They're actually monitoring um, the cars. I mean, all the rides, the millions of rides that they have worldwide is real time. I mean, they know when you got out of the car. They know what point you start with. They know you're approaching the meeting point and they know your driver is 2 minutes away, right? That's monitoring. They have the ability to do that. Credit card companies have the ability to know about your transactions. Those sort of real time type of real time monitoring is where we're going. I mean, in compliance. Now we have arrived when it comes to their business usage, as the examples I just gave. Now the question is, why are we not using the same thing? Why can't an employee who is about to sign off on a very unusual purchase order get a ping and say, are you sure about this purchase order? Why can't they do that? Because we can certainly, if credit cards companies that are processing millions of transactions every hour can do that, what's the excuse for company not being able to do that with simple purchase orders or expenses?
It's a very good question. Yeah, and
I
frankly,
mean, do you disagree?
yeah, no, I don't disagree. I mean, look, I almost feel like all of those processes exist because there is a heavy dose of realism that goes into it. So credit card companies understand when you issue a credit card, it's going to get stolen. It is quite possible it's going to get stolen. Uber understands that, things are going to go wrong in their rideshare experience. What I think in the compliance community is maybe a lack of really coming to terms with the fact that how big of an issue fraud, corruption, bribery, embezzlement, conflicts of interest are in every company. I think if you start with the proposition that there's going to be a certain amount of spend and revenue every year in every organization that's lost to fraud and corruption, that it's happening. Maybe it's that heavy dose of realism that compliance organizations need to know, okay, we understand it's happening right now. What can we do and what should we be doing to minimize the amount, how often it's happening, and making sure it's not systemic. So if it happens once, or it's being caught before the money leaves the door, or even if the money has left the door or the contract's been signed and it's been going on, we're catching it in a week as opposed to catching it 2 years later. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure why companies are still so reticent about it. We talked about it a little bit in our part one, but maybe a part of it is sort of this again, maybe sticking your head in the sand about the reality that it is happening in your organization, like it is happening in every organization. It's just how what do you want to do in response to that?
Yeah, I
So
mean, I also think it's people fool themselves, and you hear this all the time in companies, right? So when we trust our employees, they wouldn't do that.
right,
So yeah, sure, we expect customers to cheat. Apparently they do because they monitor customers very closely. But oh no, our employees, they're perfect angels. Nobody does anything wrong. And I think that's the mindset, and it's almost I think there's a reticence in part, certainly because they just don't want to believe that people can do things that they're not supposed to do.
yeah, interesting. I mean, yeah, when you look at like the ACFE findings, I mean, it's borne out year after year, the amount of money that revenue that companies lose to fraud, corruption, etc. So yeah, it's something's got to change there.
Yep.
So yeah, and maybe turning to your second point on risk silos, because I thought that was a fascinating point as well. So to me, having worked in a big organization with 90,000 employees, where you worked as well at some point,
Yes.
one of the big challenges is really like herding the cats. So you've got all of these different risk owners. They're all looking at their little slice of the pie. They're in their functional silos. On top of that, maybe there's a matrix of business unit reporting structure on top of that. So, how do you advise in-house teams to think beyond those silos to bring stakeholders? Like, how do you actually operationalize that de-siloing within the organization?
Well, I think the key to me is we have to stop thinking from the subject matter expert perspective. We have to start thinking from the employee perspective. So, so I I take that example of employees having to go through multiple due diligence on when they onboard a third party. They shouldn't have to do that. I mean, really, when you think about it, for most third party hiring, long before onboarding, there would be a business process that's led this third party to be onboarded. I mean, the business people didn't just go out and pick somebody out of a hat and say, here, onboard this, party. That's not how it works, or at least not in most responsible businesses, right? So they let's say they're trying to onboard a third party. They would have they would have identified a market need for a new distributor. And they don't just say, oh, it'd be nice to have a new distributor. Let's have one. They don't do that. Most responsible companies don't do that. There would be a market need analysis. They would then sort of scour the market to see, who would be suitable to be distributors. They would do some market research, essentially. They would shortlist people. They would invite them in for further, discussions and vetting their capacities. And after only they go through all of that, then they will have selected a party to be onboarding. So at the end of those business process, which is even prior to becoming onboarding, there's a whole lot of business information that's generated. So they already know many questions. What is the business need? What is the capacity of this distributor candidate? What is their financial situation? All of those would have been vetted before they come to onboarding. So instead of asking them for all that information 5 times from 5 different subject matter experts, can we just take the information that they already produced? And okay, so all the subject matters experts should just be able to grab the business information that comes out of that business process and say, okay, do we already have, from our perspective, what we need for this? And then if they don't, if, for example, if this is a third party that's particularly high for, high risk for data management, data privacy issues, so then the data privacy person would then say, okay, I need these additional questions answered because they are high risk based on our review of the business information. Based on that review, we've determined them to be high risk, and there remain some questions that we still need to chase down. And then you do that additional due diligence. And all this though requires a lot more thought process and effort, really, in some ways, for the subject matter experts. So we, the subject matter experts, can't sit here there like kings and queens and say, just submit your, or worse yet, like DMV, say, just give me the information again and again, according to my format, according to my convenience. Because there's also an additional risk to that, because if you're dealing with a bad employee who does want to cheat you, using that, you've just given that opportunity to them to then fabricate a whole new set of information that's inconsistent with the business information that they have relied on, and they just give you a fake set of information. Then you can go run your due diligence, right? So not only you're inconveniencing the good people, and you're making it easy for the bad people. So that's the worst thing you can do. I mean, you cannot do worse than those two things as compliance function. Is you penalize the good employees and you make it easier for the bad employees. And so to me, it's really about making things easier for the good employees and making things harder for the people who intend to do bad things. And that requires you to think from their perspective. So when somebody is going through that business process, you just take the work that they have done. You also they don't need to understand what agency, what acting on behalf means. They don't need to know why you need to know that question is for anti-corruption purposes or for competition law purposes. You can take the business information or take the additional answers to the additional questions you have. You, the subject matter experts, work amongst yourself behind the scene to figure out who needs what information. But on the front end, really, it should be very easy. Really think about your colleague, your employees as your customers. You want this experience to be easy for them. So all they should have to worry about is, okay, now I need to onboard a third party. Next, click in. That's what I want to do. Well, next set of choices. What kind of third party is this? Is this a vendor? Is this a supplier in the supply chain? Or is this somebody in the distribution channel? Oh, I will click distributors. Click into distributor. Okay, so here's where we're pulling up all the business information. And here comes the additional question. It then on the back end goes to whoever it needs to go to. But the front end people don't need to understand all these different laws to be able to just onboard somebody to do business.
Yeah.
Sorry,
no,
that was a very
exactly.
long answer.
No,
I feel very
that was-
passionate about this. Obviously.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, I think some of this is so dependent on spending the time, investing the time and effort to really map all of this out. Like just with, as we talked about on the monitoring side, is really just understanding what you're currently doing and how it can be improved by, wringing out efficiencies across. And ultimately your internal tools also have to be flexible enough to manage this. That's another big challenge that I've seen is the compliance organization has on their risk roadmap for 2020 third party ABAC. And so that's what they're going to do this year. They're going to put a process into place. They're going to put a tool into place, and then come 2021, oops, we've got to also look at IT security, but we can't layer that onto our our ABAC risk management process. And now that's sitting into a silo, sitting in a silo by itself. And so, thinking about those elements as a whole, and even when you extrapolate out of the third party space, when you think about other risks that touch third party, like conflicts of interest is a great one. I mean, almost every company that I know of is managing conflicts of interest completely disembodied from the third party management side. So someone's disclosed the conflict with a vendor in a separate system, and then that vendor is being onboarded through the third party process. Those are sitting in two separate functions within the compliance organization and two separate systems. Maybe some of it's sitting in paper, and none of those dots are being connected. So ultimately, obviously from a risk management perspective, highly counterproductive. But also, what we're going to touch on in our next podcast, part 3, is ultimately very counterproductive to your business, because it's very frustrating for the business to also have all these multiple experiences where they have to go to multiple systems to do maybe the same exact thing. So really, those are really great points. And maybe we could touch on the third part of your analysis of those 3 main areas, and about talking about, I guess, the subjectivity of the third-party risk management process today. So, just to tee that up, one anecdote that I love sharing is, talking to a company relatively recently that had really never done any due diligence on their third-party vendor base. And they had about 10,000 third parties in their vendor master file. And they told me that their idea was to send questionnaires out. They were going to use SurveyMonkey, which I also thought was quite funny. Not the most sophisticated tool to manage this, and probably a lot of data privacy issues to deal with as well with that. But regardless, they were going to send out SurveyMonkey to all their country lawyers to have the lawyers go through all 10,000 third parties and put them in buckets that lawyer X and lawyer Y thought was high, medium, and low risk third parties. And then at headquarters, they were going to decide how to perform due diligence on all of them and where to start. This was, suffice to say, as you can imagine, like a 4-year endeavor to get this all done. Strikes me, as suboptimal, let's say, from
I think you're being very generous.
From a risk management perspective, from a cost benefit analysis, from a manual versus automated perspective. So if you were faced with that same, like, you just get a new job, you show up in a company, they say, "Way, thanks, this is going to be a great job. By the way, we've got 10,000 vendors in our vendor master file that we've never done any diligence on. Go." Like, how would you approach a challenge like that?
I would start with the data. I would
I
certainly
imagine it's not SurveyMonkey.
Yes, I would start with their financial data, the spend data, as certainly a subset. So I always start with the general ledger, when I'm doing reviews of companies. And this is true when I was at DOJ. This was true when I was an in-house person, and it's true today. So it's just the. I mean, what the stories has told me, like, it's just so exasperating that I'm kind of like, but unfortunately, that's not that's not unusual. I have seen that kind of approach, and it just blows my mind. I mean, this is I love using analogies, and I don't even know what's an analogy that I could use to express just how just inane that whole approach is. And so I think that's just just suboptimal is a very generous way of putting it. So let me give you an example, which was certainly something that was, that was something I come back to quite a lot when I'm talking to companies about this issue. So there was a 2016 New York Times article about Olympus in China. So this was a story that was alleging, which I think later Olympus, had denied that the story was the way it was, but ultimately the story itself, let's take that story itself and think about how would you have approached this as a compliance officer. So the allegation in the article was that Olympus in China used a cafeteria vendor to pass bribes to resolve a custom issue. Now, in nobody's ABAC due diligence would a cafeteria vendor be categorized as high risk. Just would not. I mean, the only category I would put a cafeteria vendor as high risk in would be food safety. So it's just not high risk for most of your other types of compliance risks. And so that compliance vendor would have, that vendor, cafeteria vendor, normally, so let's take it outside of Olympus, just take that narrative and say, what if you have a subsidiary that wants to use the cafeteria vendor to do something like passing bribes? The story, again, in the story, so the spend on that cafeteria vendor after they decide to redirect the cafeteria vendor service went from tens of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars. So I remember reading this and thinking, how would I catch this? Because you in your typical system, even if you say, okay, so you onboard and you sort of, this is a cafeteria vendor, and you just wouldn't pay that much attention to it because it doesn't get on your radar screen as a high risk. The only way I thought that you could have caught that is if you monitor the spend. And why did this cafeteria vendor go from tens of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars over the last year? What caused that change? There had to be something in the system that goes ding, ding, ding when something like that level of spike goes up. That was, reading that again. I'm not sort of casting opinions on whether that's true or not. I'm just taking that narrative as a way of thinking through how would you catch something like that. Now, what if you had the situation, what if you discover when you're looking at vendor spend that there's a cafeteria vendor that you're paying $3 million a year to, and then you find out, this is when I talk about contextualizing the data and comparing with other, that your employee population in that place is 200 employees who in no way should be generating a $3 million a year cafeteria budget. What if there is no cafeteria on site?
Right.
And yet you're paying $3 million to somebody who's characterized as a cafeteria vendor. So the only way to catch something like that would be to monitor the spend and having that system that tells you something is out of whack. So I remember, reading that article back in 2016 when I was still at DOJ, and just thinking through that narrative was very, very instructive to me.
Yeah, and I think it calls to mind for me, for just reading the Airbus pleadings a couple of days ago, just one of the allegations, and I think they admitted to this, sort of a $50 million sponsorship to a football club that was connected to a government official in some capacity. Again, a 50 million sponsorship. I mean, maybe that's, happens at an Airbus, but it probably doesn't happen every day. And is that getting flagged? Is it getting closer review? Just looking at that data. Again, there's many other things in that case and other cases that, were very illustrative of what you just mentioned. But yeah, the cafeteria vendor is a perfect example of that. sort of, and then again, this over reliance on that front end, high, medium, low would mean that, even when the audit team shows up on that market, they're not going to pick any invoices potentially from that. They may not pick any invoices from that cafeteria vendor because they're not in their list of high risk vendors for that market. So yeah, no, I mean, it does, as you, Hui, have done throughout your career, sort of like flipping the script on how companies have done things and think about things for the last 15 years. It's really kind of the type of thinking that, we really appreciate you bringing to the market. Especially as compliance teams are being asked to do more with less, when you even take that into account, how much more, again, effective and efficient and also accurate can your compliance program be when you're taking that approach? So
absolutely.
Thanks so much, Hui, for your time today. I think that's probably a good point to end this discussion on third-party risk management. As again, for our listeners, please tune in to episodes 1 and also 3, where we're going to be where we talked about data analytics on spend data, and also we'll be talking about using digital transformation to enable more ethical decision making by your own business. So again, thank you so much, Hui, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.